Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Do you have an i5 6th or 7th generation system? Do you want to upgrade your system to get several more years of use out of it, higher levels of performance, better multitasking, better multiplayer gaming performance, without having to change everything in your system or replace it completely? You've come to the right place. This is an i5 that I have upgraded to an i7. In fact, this had a 6th generation Skylake locked i5 installed, and we have put a 7700K on here. More than 1 gigahertz faster clock speed, 100% more threads, 8 threads now instead of 4, and much better overall experience. I also added a solid state drive, and in a few minutes the camera's going to be overhead and we're going to show you that process. We remove the Intel stock cooler, we replace it with an inexpensive Hyper 212 Evo. I'm going to show you temperature before and after tests so you can see how well that works on a higher end processor, and I'm going to show you how we install the SSD into this system. This specific computer is the $720 CyberPower PC that I've reviewed multiple times on my channel starting back in 2016. It was a great value for the money at the time, although I wouldn't buy one today. If you're buying an entire new system, Ryzen or Coffee Lake is where it's at. But if you already have one, the whole point of this video is to show you how you can in fact get a nice upgrade without ripping out the motherboard, without having to reinstall Windows, or even buy a whole new computer. Linked in the video description below will be links to Amazon, Newegg, and eBay, because you might find a good deal on one of these used as people race to upgrade to Ryzen or Coffee Lake. If you can find one of these there, then by all means pick up a good deal. Do make sure you get the K chip, however, and not the non-K chip. Unlike the 8th generation, there is a notable performance difference between the K and the non-K chip, so unless the price difference is massive, skip the non-K chip and get a 7700K. It is true that most of these computers do not have an overclockable motherboard. This particular machine has the MSI B150, not 250, it's a 100 series B150 motherboard, takes the chip just fine, turbos on all 4 cores and 8 threads to 4.4 gigahertz, no problem. Great performance and notably better than a 7700 non-K. The only thing to be aware of with these systems, make sure you update your BIOS before you do this upgrade, because the original launch BIOS on these motherboards did not support 7th generation chips. But you can install the 7th gen chips, including the 7700K, on a B150, just so long as you update the BIOS before you do the installation. CPU-Z is a free tool you can download to learn all about your computer, including running a built-in benchmark. In general, you're going to get under 400 points with an i5 6400 in the single-threaded test and under 1500 points in the multi-threaded test. Please note, this is version 1.8.1. Different versions of CPU-Z will give different results, but if you want to have an idea of what your system will get, this is what this CyberPower PC with the B150 motherboard did when upgraded to a 7700K, and you should get similar performance. The only other benchmark I'm going to show you is 7-zip, which is a highly multi-threaded, very memory-demanding test, over 27,000 MIPS. The only reason I'm showing you these two is to show you that the 7700K runs at full speed on this B150 motherboard. This simply validates all the other results that I've done. I've tested the 7700K extensively, so I'm not including endless results here. This is simply a reference point to reassure you that yes, the 7700K is just fine on this board. Last but not least, here are the AIDA64 test results with the 7700K in this system with the case closed, the side panel was installed. You can see down on the bottom that we're turboing to 4.4 gigahertz on all 4 cores, 8 threads, and you can see that the CPU topped out at 75 degrees C with the Hyper 212 Evo. Please note that AIDA64 is not a realistic normal daily use test. This is an extreme stress test. Normal gaming in this machine is closer to 60 degrees C with the CPU and cooler installed. I mentioned better gaming and better multitasking at the beginning of this video. Let me give you some specifics. First of all, gaming. Battlefield 1 multiplayer is well known to be much smoother on an i7 than an i5. The 4-core, 4-thread i5s will play Battlefield 1. In fact, if you play Battlefield 1, you might say, well, I play it, it's okay, what's the problem? Have you played it on an i7? You might go, whoa, that's a whole lot better. It's smoother when you turn, when you move. Everything is just much, much nicer. It doesn't necessarily give you more frames per second. It gives you better frames per second. It gives you more consistent frame delivery. Ghost Recon Wildlands and other games that have come out in the past year also are smoother on the i7 if not necessarily tons faster. Now, if you are live streaming and you want to live stream, for example, to Twitch or to YouTube, the i7 is much better than the i5 is, especially for those kinds of games. Now, ideally, you'd have a 6-core or 8-core processor if you're live streaming on the same machine that you're gaming on, but if you're live streaming games, most will do just fine on a 4-core, 8-thread i7, and much better than they will on a 4-core, 4-thread i5. The same is true, notably, if you record your games, but regardless, you're going to get smoother performance both online and offline, you're going to get better frame delivery, and because this is between 1.1 and 1.4 gigahertz faster than the various locked i5s, going from the 6400 to the 7400, what you're going to find is that a lot of games do in fact run faster if you have a good enough graphics card, depending of course on the resolution you're running at. A couple of other examples, even in offline gameplay. MMOs, games like World of Tanks, World of Warships, all play better because of the clock speed. Star Wars The Old Republic is a game I have a lot of time in. That game doesn't need more than 4 cores or 4 threads. In fact, it really only uses 2. But what it wants is clock speed, and there are still a lot of games out there that want clock speed. 4.4 gigahertz on all 4 cores and 8 threads versus 3.2 to 3.4 gigahertz on all 4 cores, 4 threads on most of the i5s. So you're going to see a greater than 1 gigahertz clock speed difference, which in certain games will translate to a much better experience. And finally, for multitasking, do you have a lot of browser tabs open? Do you run 10 or 15 programs at once? Do you game on one monitor while browsing the web and doing other things on the other monitor? Then a 4-core, 8-thread chip will be a noticeable improvement in terms of smoothness and system responsiveness than a 4-core, 4-thread chip such as the i5s. Do you do content creation? Do you do video editing, video rendering? Those will also run faster on the i7 than they will the i5. Now, this is about a $300 CPU today on the day I'm recording this in December 2017. You might be able to find it less for used. I mentioned the links will be down in the description below, Amazon, Newegg, and eBay. Of course, if you find one for $200 or $250, that's great. I didn't find any on that on the day I recorded it. But you can sell your existing i5 CPU for about $100. All of the locked i5s from the 6400 to the 7400 are currently selling for about $100 on eBay, which is pretty much what they're worth at this point because they're equivalent to the i3 Coffee Lake chips 4-core, 4-thread. So if you spend $300 on this and you sell your current i5 for $100, that means your upgrade costs you $200. $200 is a really good deal. You cannot replace the motherboard and CPU for $200 and then get something that's really worth the trouble of upgrading. You can get close. The other option you have is to go with a Ryzen 5 1600. 6 cores, 12 threads, runs really well at 3.7 gigahertz on all 6 cores, but that requires a motherboard replacement, roughly $200 to $220 for the CPU and roughly $80 to $100 for the motherboard. Now, if your existing system has DDR4 RAM, it'll move out of your existing board and into the Ryzen board just fine. But if you have DDR3 RAM, which some Skylake systems came with, then you need RAM replacement. Be sure to check what kind of RAM you have before you think about doing it. But the big elephant in the room with that upgrade are 2 points. One, the clock speed is lower, 4.4 gigahertz versus 3.7. Yes, it has fewer cores, but they're faster. Now, all things being equal, if you offered me the 2 chips at the same price, I would actually take a Ryzen 5 1600. I think the 6 cores will last longer. But the motherboard change kills it, and the Windows issue kills it. When you put the CPU in here, you don't have to reactivate Windows, you don't have to change drivers, you do not have to reinstall Windows, you don't have to change anything. In fact, when I put the CPU in here, the only thing that happened when I booted up is a BIOS message came up that said CPU change, press F1 to enter setup, press F2 to load defaults. I pressed F2 to load defaults, Windows booted, everything worked first time, there was not a single thing to be done. If you change the motherboard for a Ryzen 5 1600 or a Coffee Lake for that matter, you may need a reinstall. You might get away with it on Coffee Lake without it, but with Ryzen you definitely will need a reinstall. Worse, when you change the motherboard, Windows will deactivate. You might talk Microsoft into reactivating it, but keep in mind that if you bought something like this CyberPower, they come with OEM copies of Windows. It's married to the motherboard, so you may end up having to buy another copy of Windows. This is why this is such an attractive option for people who currently own a locked i5. It gives you a great upgrade path, great performance improvement without having to change your entire system or worry about reinstalling Windows, worrying about activation. It just works, and it honestly doesn't take very long to do. If you look here on the desk, you'll see I have two coolers here. $30 and $40 respectively is the normal retail on these, although there's a lot of sales, so check the links for those down in the description below as well to Amazon and Newegg. The Hyper 212 Evo has no problem cooling this at stock speeds. I would not recommend it for overclocking, but we're not overclocking B150 motherboard, so it's fine. Now, the temperature is warmer on this with that cooler than a locked i5 is on the Intel stock cooler. The power draw, the voltage, and the temperature rise are real on the i7s versus the i5s, but it's fine. The temperatures are around 70 to 75 degrees C in AIDA64 stress testing. You're going to see something closer to 60 degrees C in normal gaming, because AIDA64 is always more demanding than running games actually are. Please note that those temperatures are in this system with the side panel attached. It's not open air, it's not getting a bonus air circulation, so it's just fine. If, on the other hand, you are in a hot environment, perhaps you don't have air conditioning, perhaps it's just very hot where you live, then I would spend the few extra dollars to get a Master Liquid 120 Lite. You can replace the back exhaust fan on the case with the radiator and exhaust the heat out the back, and that will take a few degrees off the temperature and work better in hot environments. For a 7700K on a locked motherboard, you don't need to spend any more than this. Going to a 240mm cooler, 280, a large, huge tower cooler is not going to improve your performance any. It's not going to run faster. It's not going to turbo faster. $30 to $40 is all that you need to spend on a nice cooler. Now, technically, you can keep the Intel stock cooler and not replace the cooler. I don't recommend it. You're going to have heat and temp issues. I know, I've tried it. I've tried the Intel stock coolers on the i7s. They simply are not good enough, so you're going to need to replace the cooler. So that's a few extra dollars. But as I said, you can often find those on sale. Check the links. And without any further ado, let me put the camera overhead and show you what this looked like when we did the upgrade. And again, thank you to my son for helping me with the upgrade. And here you see the computer is on the desk. I've taken the side off. You can see our solid state drive, our new CPU cooler, and our new CPU right here. I've got new thermal paste, which you'll need. Most coolers tend to come with it, but not all do, so make sure you have thermal paste because you can't reuse what's on the existing cooler. And everybody say hi to my son, Matthew.
Hello.
This is where you go. Hi.
Hello.
Well, there is my son, Matthew, and he is, how old are you?
12.
Oh, 12. If a 12-year-old can upgrade this computer, so can you. Now, if you look at where this existing cooler is, you'll see that it's going to be hard to work in here with the graphics card and the RAM. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove those to make it easy to work, and then we'll install our new things. So what Matthew is going to do is remove the screw here that is holding the graphics card in. It's at this point that I'm simply going to comment that I have to cut most of this out. There is over 1 hour and 30 minutes worth of footage here because I had to explain and teach my son how to do various things. We had to stop to get a drink of water, that sort of thing. So there's going to be a lot of heavy cuts here. And with that screw off, the graphics card is now disconnected. Now we need to remove the two power cables. There are little clips on each side here that have to be pushed in with your finger, and then they can be pulled straight off. You should use your hand to secure the graphics card when you pull them off so that you don't push the graphics card from side to side. Almost everything was entirely done by my son. The only major thing that I ended up doing was pulling the existing CPU out of the socket because that either requires a fingernail or using a tool, and it is a bit delicate. I'll mention that when we get to it. Otherwise, he actually did all of the work. All I did was guide him and give him instruction. Yay. There you go. And we got that one pulled out. I ended up helping him with the first one. The 8-pin connector is really stuck in there. The only challenge with a 12-year-old is sometimes just in terms of strength, these can be really stuck on there. But he got the 6-pin just fine. With the power cables out of the way, now you want to be sure to push the small white tab that's holding the card in. Push that in, and then the card will come straight out. But often the cards will not actually pull straight out. They can be very stiff in the slot. So sometimes you have to provide a gentle rocking motion, not much, back and forth this way. Do not rock this way or you'll break the card. Only this way, and just work the card slowly out. There you go. And Matthew got the card out all on his own. Good job, buddy.
Yay.
With our card out, now we need to move our system RAM. I mean, technically you could do this, but it's going to be very hard with the RAM in the way. It's just much easier to remove it. Now I'm going to remove the first one to show Matthew here. There's two tabs, one on the bottom and one on the top. that you simply pop out of the way. With these two tabs popped out, the RAM simply pulls straight out just like that. These small plastic tabs can be a little tricky. You do have to give them a little bit of force to pop the RAM out. The top one needs to go more. There you go. Well, that was a whole lot easier, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Do the other two. Some pieces of the footage like this I'm going to leave in, but this is accelerated 3 times. Otherwise, the video again would be quite long. And we got another one out. I normally remove this from build videos, but I want you to see my son doing it. And there we go. All the system RAM is out. Just as a side note, this is the RAM that the CyberPower PC originally came with. 8 gigabytes of RAM, 2 4 gig sticks. These are 2 more 4 gig sticks that I added during the actual upgrade process many months ago when we first got this machine, so it has 16 gigs of total RAM. With the RAM removed and the graphics card removed, now it's time to remove the Intel CPU cooler that came on the i5 CPU this machine shipped with. I will do the first one. A flathead screwdriver makes this easier. It's not strictly required, but these are going to turn 90 degrees. Once they turn 90 degrees, they will simply pop straight up. If you ever need to install one, they need to be in this orientation, and they actually snap down just like that. The way you release them, turn them 90 degrees, and then they just, there we go, pop straight up. I'll give this to Matthew. Just turn the other 3 90 degrees. There you go. Now we want to remove the power to the fan. Just pull that right off the motherboard straight up with your hands. There you go. Now with that off, you can just take the cooler and pull it straight off the board. Pull the other one out. There you go. Now, just to show everybody on camera, there is actually not very much thermal paste here. It's basically dried up. Now, I know a lot of people are concerned about thermal paste and does it dry over time. This computer is about a year old at this point because this is the original i5 6402P, not the 7400, because I've got 2 of these. And this is definitely dried up. Let me tell you, there are no temperatures issues with this. With i5 locked core CPUs, you generally have no problem with the stock coolers. With unlocked chips and i7s, you should use third-party coolers, but these are actually just fine for a locked i5. Now we're going to clean off this. Now you may need some isopropyl alcohol to get all of it off, which I'll remove in a minute, but you can just take a little bit of tissue. Actually, with some good old-fashioned scrubbing. That just took a little bit of elbow grease. I didn't end up having to use alcohol on that. All I did was use pressure and some tissue, and it just rubbed clean off the CPU. Here you can see the CPU currently covered by this metal retention bracket. What we have to do is we have to push this lever down, pull it out, and pull it all the way back, and it will lift this metal bracket off of the CPU. The CPU is actually being held down by these 2 parts right here. Now, in the process of doing this, we discovered something interesting. If you don't have fingernails, this can actually be quite tricky to get off. Now, I have fingernails, and so it's fairly easy for me to reach under the lip here and just lift the CPU straight up just like that. You could use a very fine screwdriver, such as the one that we were using earlier. This would reach under here and actually lift the CPU up, but you've got to be very careful. And the reason for that is the pins are on the motherboard, they're not on the CPU. Now the challenge is my son does not have any fingernails because, like all 12-year-olds, he bites his fingernails. And so we played around with this for a few minutes, and try as he might, using just his fingers, he could not lift that off. Now I thought about having him use a screwdriver, but the problem with a screwdriver is it's so easy to go too far under here and hit the pins. And if you break 2 or 3 of those pins, you don't have a useful motherboard anymore. So as much as I would love to have my son do that, I would like you to be aware that if you don't have fingernails, this is going to be tricky because there's nothing to grab onto with the CPU. So to change the CPU out, which I will do for him, we're simply going to pull up on the CPU, grab the sides with our fingers, and pull it out. There's nothing under here except capacitors and voltage things and other things. Other than that, they're just flat on the bottom, and we'll just set that down on the table. These are the 1155 or 56 depending on your motherboard. These are the 1100 and change pins that actually connect to the CPU. The older chips and AMD chips do it differently, where there's holes on the motherboard and there's pins on the CPU. It's just really tough to get these off if you don't have something to pry it off with. And now my son has the CPU and he's going to show you how to install it. Start with the top end and make sure you have the 2 notches lined up right here. Turn it 90 degrees that way. There we go. And line up the 2 notches just like that. And just set it down. And if you want to check the positioning of it, it doesn't move. The 2 notches there are lined up. The triangle is lined up in the corner where it belongs. You don't push on the CPU. If it doesn't rest cleanly, it's not oriented correctly. But the key is these 2 notches right here. Once those notches are in place, then we're going to lower this cover, which I'll have him do. And then once the cover is down, make sure it's under this right here, those 2 notches, and then he's going to push it forward. And he's going to push it all the way down and clip it. There we go. These are holding the CPU in place. Our new i7 7700K is fully installed on our motherboard. To protect your CPU, always be sure to keep it in one of these plastic containers. Best way to keep it safe. Before we put the new cooler on, or the graphics card, or the RAM, we're going to install our extra SSD. Now, when I originally did the upgrade in this machine, I put a 480 gigabyte solid state drive right here. That's where the crucial BX200 is. Now, we're leaving that in place as the boot drive, but we're adding more SSD storage because games keep getting bigger, and that is what our AddLink S10 512 gig SSD is for. We're going to install it on this plate right here. There's a screw here to take the plate off the board. We'll screw it into the back, put it here. One thing that I've added is a power adapter cable. This is a 4-pin Molex to a 15-pin SATA power connector. Now, you don't have to use this. There are actually SATA power connectors in there, but I'd have to take the whole thing apart, cut them, re-zip tie them. I had this adapter handy and it reaches perfectly. It'll work just fine. But one way or another, you'll need to get a SATA power cable up here if you want to install an SSD to this drive tray. So the first thing Matthew's going to do is unscrew that screw right there and take the back plate off. Now here's the back plate. You can see the screws. We take our solid state drive and we line the holes up, and we're simply going to mount it like this on top, screwing through on the bottom. Then we have our power and data ports, which are going to stick right here, and we'll plug it into our ports on the motherboard. I put the first one in to show him, and then he put the other 3 screws in. You know, you don't have to put them in tightly. You just basically need small screws. Most cases come with these. You're not probably going to get that with most pre-built, so you may need some small screws in order to mount that. Most SSDs don't come with screws, so you may need a mounting kit with screws if you don't have one. And now my son is going to remount this in the computer. When you do the power cable, take a look at this notch right here. On the drive there is an L-shaped notch as well. You want to make sure to line up the notch so that it goes onto the drive in the correct orientation, as we will now demonstrate. Our power cable is now installed, and yes, it's here, but that's not going to bother anything. Now we're going to take the data cable. Because most serial ATA cables are long, what we're actually going to do is run the cable behind the tray here. And it's short enough here and there's enough access that we don't have to take the back panel off. Depending upon your case, you may need to take the back panel off. But what he's doing is he's just putting the cable through this hole, through here, under that slot, and then coming back around so that the cable is not getting in the way of the graphics card or anything else. And there we go. This side is now clipped in for data. Our power cable is plugged in. Our data cable for the SSD is plugged in. And I'll just tuck this out of the way. That's never going to bother anything. We still have plenty of room for our graphics card to come back. And we have now successfully added 512 gigs of storage, giving us a total of about 1 terabyte of SSD space. When it comes to installing the coolers, You really need to read through the instructions. It's sort of a measure twice, cut once sort of thing. The standard Intel CPU cooler is pretty straightforward because it just goes right on. It just push pins directly into the holes on the motherboard. There's nothing fancy to be done. But the larger coolers require a backplate, which you can see right down here. Now the backplate itself is right here, and that actually has to go on the back of the motherboard. So in just a minute, we're going to actually have to take the back panel off and turn this over in order to put this on. What I want you to see is that there are some screws right here that go through the holes, right here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, and those screw into the back plate. The reason this is important is because then the cooler screws to these screws on this side of the board. So the back plate and the posts have to be installed with the back of the motherboard accessible. Now this case has room for it, but if you have an older case that doesn't give you access to the motherboard, you would actually have to take the whole motherboard out of the system in order to mount this type of cooler. But most cases made in the past 5 years or so do provide access to the back of the motherboard. Now we have the computer turned on the back and we can see everything behind the motherboard. I've got the back plate inserted where it belongs. Here's the trick. These screws have to be put through the other side, through these holes here. We have nuts that have to be screwed into them to secure the back plate on. And then this driver, you put your screwdriver in here, it goes on the nut and it tightens it. This is virtually impossible to film just because of the fact that you have to have access to both sides of the motherboard at the same time, and you almost need 3 sets of arms. I do like the Hyper 212 Evo. It is an excellent cooler. For the money, it is an incredible value. The mounting system is a bit old school, and so just be patient with it. Read the instructions twice, take your time, and just be aware that you really do need to access both sides of the motherboard at the same time. Rather than even try to show you on camera the entire process, I'm just going to show you a little bit of the cut scene where my son was holding one side and I'm trying to get it through the other. This is where the 3 arms comes in really handy. This is something that to film properly, I'd have to have the camera set up on a tripod at an angle. I'd have to have a backdrop. Frankly, it's just challenging for me to put this on camera. Let me just say that if you are patient and you look at the directions carefully, put everything in place before you screw or bolt anything in place, take your time. It's not complicated. You're just putting a few pieces together, but it's not something that you just want to rush into without reading the directions. Our backplate is now mounted on the motherboard. If you look here, you will see 4 nuts holding on those screws from the other side. This is our Hyper 212 Evo. You can see the metal part with the 4 direct contact heat pipes and then the fan. This needs to be removed in order to install it. It then just clips right back on. These come off and then the whole fan just slides right off. Just like that. And then once we actually have it in, this will just clip right back on. If you look inside the case, you will now see the 4 posts that we mounted onto the motherboard. That's what's bolted to the backplate behind it. Now this is going to install just like so. It actually can be mounted either way because of the fact that it's a square, but if you mount it this way, you do run into the issue of having your RAM blocked. If you mount it this way, your graphics card is going to be really close to it, but it's going to be okay. So for most people, I would mount it in this orientation in order to avoid blocking your RAM slots. Now before we install it, the first thing we need to do is put our thermal paste onto the CPU. And so now my son is going to put the thermal paste on. 1 grain of rice is about the amount of thermal paste, and stick it right in the center of the CPU. Just like that. There you go.
That?
Yeah, it's plenty. And now we have almost a little bit too much thermal paste, but well, that's okay. That's a lot. That's like 3 rice grains worth of paste.
Oops.
Yeah, it's all right. Nobody's perfect. To install our cooler, we need to take this and actually make it small like this in order to fit it right through here. There's a peg that mounts to the bottom, and then we can spread it to the X pattern. Just like the X-Men, you can see here we have an X pattern. There is our flat plate there. This does not actually connect. It screws down and it holds down with tension. So as I hold it like this, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. This is going to go straight down, but it's not going to hold until we screw all of them in. And you got to line these 4 screws up and screw them into the posts without moving this around too much, picking it up, setting it down, or having this move. If this sounds like it's challenging and interesting, it can be. I sometimes have to redo it. So if you ever have trouble with this, you may end up in a situation where you put it down and pick it up so many times you've moved the paste around, you may actually want to clean it off and try again. But we're going to see if we can do this on the first try. So with this already in place, I'm going to hand it to my son. I may just guide this with one hand to help him, but otherwise, he has got it. I'm just going to help right here. There you go. Keep coming down. Yes. Now hold on to that with your hand. If you're watching this thinking two people are easier, it is. Because I can see this better than he can, and I'm guiding the screw into the hole for him. Just push down with some more pressure.
Like?
Yeah. Can you feel it catch?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Now come over here and do this one.
Do I still have to hold it?
Yeah. It's pretty secure now, though. Might have to push down to get the threads to catch. There you go. Now do this corner. Don't push any of the screws in all the way until you've done all of them halfway. So do this one now halfway. We're trying to even out the pressure of the CPU and the cooler onto the CPU itself. Yeah, let's not do that. There we go. Now take that all the way down. It's got a spring on it. When you screw these screws down, they'll screw until they get tight and then stop.
So do I push down?
No, and then do the other three. I'll check it in a second. I'm just going to go around here and check them all. That's tight. Now I have gone around the four sides. This is an important thing to check because this screw back here felt like it was in, but it really wasn't in all the way, and so this was still a bit loose. This should be very hard to move. You can turn it just a bit, but this should be very firmly in place. So be sure to go all the way around and double check. Don't be afraid to look at them from the side or an angle, and make sure that they are, don't tighten it to the point of crazy, but tighten it till it's fairly tight. Now here we have the fan. Now ideally we want the fan to blow in this direction in order to blow towards the exhaust. There are several ways to accomplish this. We can simply install the fan here to blow through the tower cooler towards the exhaust fan, and the heat will go right out the back of the system. The only downside is because we're using all four RAM slots, if you actually mount this right here, your clearance to the first RAM slot is, to be completely honest, pretty terrible. It does fit, but there's not much room. Now you can actually mount it to this side of the cooler, but doing so, the fan blows this way. And the problem with having the fan blow this way is now you've got this fan blowing out, this fan blowing here, low pressure, and you really get a poor circulation of air. Now another alternative, of course, is to turn it 90 degrees, but then again, RAM slots. You can also switch this fan around. It's just 4 screws in the back. We take it out, we simply flip it over, and then this fan will blow in. We then have 1, 2, 3 air intakes, but in this particular case, because there is a very large opening on the top of the case, lots of air will then come out of the top of the case. That is another alternative. The other option is this fan is reversible. There are screw holes here, and you could put the mounting brackets over here and mount it here blowing that way. Although I don't actually recommend that you do that because, frankly, I think that blowing onto the cooler is better, but that's my opinion. And so now I'm going to have my son undo the 4 screws to this fan. We're going to turn it around to an intake, mount the cooler's fan over here, and basically all the air is going to come out of the top of the case. Now all we're going to do is take this fan and we are simply going to turn it around and turn it into an intake fan because it's got screw holes on both sides. That's all there is to it to turn that into an intake. With the back case fan turned around, now we have to install the fan on the cooler itself. This 4-pin connector plugs into the CPU power connector on the motherboard. It's the same one that the Intel stock cooler was plugged into. This allows the motherboard to control the speed of the fan. When there's a demand and a load and the temperature's rising, it will increase the speed of the fan. When the system is idle or in power saving mode, it can slow the fan down and thus make it run quieter and use less energy. Please note that when you install the fan, make sure that it's level with the top of the cooler and that all 4 clips on all 4 sides are attached. It is now time to install the system RAM. Make sure all the tabs are actually marked out rather than up. If they're up, then you can't insert the RAM. So make sure that each tab is actually out and then insert the RAM into the guide slots on both ends of the slot. There is a notch in the middle of the RAM. The notch is not in the center, so the RAM cannot be reversed and turned around. Look at where the slot is on your motherboard. You'll notice I turn it around, it will not fit. You've got to make sure that the slot is actually lined up with that notch. When you insert the RAM, push straight down on both ends. It doesn't go in at an angle, and both sides will automatically click in, and the tabs will pop up automatically. It is now time to install the graphics card. Lining the graphics card up simply involves making sure it goes straight down in and straight out. You don't tilt it or bend it because otherwise you can break the golden fingers that go into the motherboard. Also, please note these back two tabs here have to clear the motherboard. So when it goes down, make sure you're going far enough back that it does not actually strike and contact the motherboard. Some cases, you have to go down and then move horizontally towards the back of the case during installation. And there you have it, the system upgrade is complete. It really isn't that hard to do. Frankly, the hardest thing is to install the cooler more than anything else because it isn't just 4 push pins like the Intel stock cooler, but it's worth it because those are in fact much better coolers. Just make sure that you're careful with the motherboard and the pins. Taking the CPU off, putting the new one on is really the only delicate part of the process. The rest of it's basically like an erector set, or perhaps Lego if you're not as old as I am and don't remember erector from the 1980s. But the system booted the first time, it works great, and it is faster, and it's now going to last several more years with 4 cores, 8 threads at 4.4 gigahertz versus the old CPU. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel with the big huge red button directly below. Questions and comments in the comment section. And as always, check out the links in the video description. They are all affiliate links, Amazon, Newegg, and eBay. So please use those when you're shopping if you found this video helpful and useful. It supports the channel and I would be greatly appreciative. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.